So I was cleaning out some old boxes the other day and I stumbled upon something incredible. My old game cartridge of Pokémon Silver. This game single-handedly got me addicted to Pokémon, and it was my favorite game growing up. And playing it again, it was just such a nostalgia trip. But it also reminded me of one thing: how much I wanted to have my own Pokémon when I was a kid. But you know what? I'm an adult now. And I still don't have a Pokémon. What the heck? It's supposed to be the future. So this all changes today. So I need to make my own. Now, I'm not a biologist, so splitting genes and playing God is kind of out of the question on this one. But I can generally make stuff. So I'm going to build myself a life-sized version of my favorite Pokémon, Squirtle. You see, he is objectively the coolest starter Pokémon ever. And if you disagree with that, that's totally fine. Except you're wrong, and I will fight you, and you're dead to me. I'm also going to be building the entire thing out of stained glass because it's a new material that I want to try out, and it should be amazing having a life-size Pokemon made out of it. But then to make this even more complicated than it already is, I don't want just a regular 2D flat image of stained glass. No, the 2D stuff, that's for video games. I want a real 3-dimensional creation. So here's the plan. Step 1 is to design and build a digital model. Step 2 is to plan out all of the pieces of glass that need to get cut. And then step 3 is to assemble an ungodly amount of pieces of glass into something that should hopefully resemble a Pokemon. Step 4 is to hopefully not lose my sanity, but that's kind of an optional step. Creating a digital model for this will be really important because I've never done any of this before, and it will be extremely useful, but I'll show you that later on. First though, we need a rough model to start. Thankfully, there are Pokemon models all over the internet. I have a Squirtle model here, but there are already some problems to start. First off, we need to lower the poly count on it so it's more geometric, and I don't really like the mouth on this one, so I want to swap it out with parts from a different model. So we are just going to carefully come in here and then violently rip its head off. Now, after carefully separating a different head from another model, we can blend these together to start, and it's good as new. Now for the process of reducing the mesh. Currently there are 1.2 million triangles that make up this model, and normally that's perfectly fine. But for what I need, that's way too many since I'm envisioning each of these faces as a piece of glass. So we will reduce the model's poly count down to something more reasonable. Now the model is looking a lot more how I envisioned it in my head. Each of these little triangles is going to be its own little piece of glass. And so with the Hold on. Okay, I may have goofed a little bit. I meant to be searching for low poly Squirtle models instead of regular Squirtle models, and those already exist, so that gives me a much better starting point. So the other model kind of got Frankenstein for no reason. We'll kind of just move past that. So this new model I found is a 3D print file off of printables, and after doing the same reduction in the poly count, I'm going to move it over into SketchUp now just to do the last little bits of refining on the points by hand, just so I can get it exactly how I want, which should hopefully go pretty quick. I don't want to talk about it. I'm also worried because I feel like the last time I recorded something here, I said something really stupid about this going super quick. And even just finding and fine-tuning all of the tiny little parts on this has kind of just been a nightmare. But the first part of the digital model is now done. So I went ahead and took him and scaled him up to be the size that he needs to be. I took his height from the Pokédex to know how big I need to make him so that he can be life-sized. And he's pretty big, which will also cause some other problems, but we'll deal with that later. I could talk way too long about all of the tiny little things that I had to do to make this model work and to convert it into something that would be a good template for the steps moving forward, but that would honestly be kind of boring and that would take a long time. So I'm just going to speed up all of the footage of me complaining into 5 seconds to kind of summarize it all. But in the end, it was just, ooh, tiny little monkey brain thought. And now we're here. Did you get all that? Good. This is just a start though, since everything is a thin plane and it needs thickness, so I can go ahead and dice this model up to make the parts of the physical model for it to be a guide. Once it has thickness, I can then 3D print all of it into separate parts, since this is a pretty large project. And these prints will take a while, but it's really the best way that I can think of to get all of these angles correct. Now after a lot of work of planning, printing, assembling, finishing, this is what we're left with. Well, the first half at least. Even though this is only half the model, even just the 3D printed part, it's so cool. And you know, it's kind of like me. It's a little rough on the exterior, but on the inside, it's just a shell. An empty being. Just a void of nothingness. Anyways, we can use this as an underlay for all of the stained glass to just sit right on top of, so that each of the pieces that I cut will be in the exact position they need to be in relation to all of the other complicated angles, so that I can fuse them together. And then all of the 3D printed guide parts should be designed that they can just slip right out afterwards, and then we just have the stained glass. Speaking of the stained glass, that's the next part. I have these stained glass sheets that now need to get cut up to be smaller parts. I have 3 colors to use. This color will be for the belly, this one will be for the shell, and this one will be for the arms, legs, and head. This is the part where the digital model becomes so helpful. I went through the same process of extruding these surfaces to act as stained glass to see where there would be any problems or collisions, and just adjusted all of the stained glass to hopefully avoid any of those types of problems. I can then take all of those surfaces and then lay them out to act as a guide for me to know what I need to cut around. I then laser cut some tape to match those specific shapes so that I would be able to transfer what's in the computer onto the glass. And pretty soon we're left with something like this. The layout is a little weird because of how you should cut stained glass. From what I have read, you should do cuts that go from end to end. So I laid all of this out so it will always be that way as I cut the glass down further to make smaller and smaller pieces. But first we are going to need something to cut all of this glass out with, and luckily there is a special tool made just for this purpose. This is a glass cutter, and it kinda looks like a little mini pizza cutter, but it does not work well as one. Look, I know this is a really stupid bit, but I have to film this and then put it in the video because now the pizza is a business expense and I can write it off on my taxes. So just roll with it. Get it? Because roll with, never mind. I scored the first cut on the glass where I wanted to break, and then I used these special pliers to help break the glass. And after just a little bit of pressure, I have ruined my first piece. Now this isn't great. The break line traveled off of my score mark a little bit and it's kind of already ruined pretty much the biggest piece I have on this project. And it was at this point I realized this was not going to be as easy as I had hoped. I just continued on though, trying to cut out the pieces as best that I could and get used to the whole process since I will be doing this for pretty much the next 12 hours. But shortly after, I finally have my first perfect piece cut out, after ruining 3 others beyond repair. In total for that first sheet, I have about 16 pieces that are usable. On day 2 of breaking all of this glass, I started working on the belly a little bit, and I don't know if this glass was easier to work with or if I was just more confident now, but I just landed in the perfect rhythm for this sheet. And after that, I then moved on to the first parts of cutting out the shell. And with those pieces, I wanted to start assembling this whole thing, even though I still have a lot more pieces that I need to cut. I need to wrap all of the edges in copper foil so that the solder has something to grab onto and can join all of these pieces together. And this was a very tedious process, as you can tell by the super nice and centered shot where you can clearly see what's going on. For soldering, this was one thing I didn't really consider in how I actually do the process. And this was a little awkward since how all of these pieces are standing up and not laying flat, but I put some flux onto the joints to help the solder join to the copper, and I'm only going to join it in small parts for now, and then I will come back through later and make the joint one big clean solder line. Putting these together, it was pretty clear off the start that I might need to adjust some of these pieces as I go, since there are multiple pieces all trying to come together, and that doesn't really leave a lot of room for error, and one small error can then build and compound into the other pieces. But finally holding the first parts of this, it just got me so excited to see more progress. The 3D printed guide is still a good idea, but it isn't as idiot-proof as I had hoped. Since after working with these first couple pieces, I'm worried about both of these halves coming together, but I will talk more about that part when the first half of this is actually done. I finished getting the foil on a lot of these other pieces, and then I started to build out the tail as well, which brought up some other problems of actually getting the soldering iron back into weird places like behind the shell and the tail. It's not really easy to solder back there, but the good news is you don't really ever see that part. I went back and worked on the head after this as well, and you will notice that I have not really put eyes on this yet. I have tried a couple of different iterations and I can't really get anything that I like. On an older model that I was developing but didn't end up using, I had just used little happy squinty eyes. But that didn't feel quite right, and the actual eyes from his Pokemon art isn't really a good match either, so they might end up just being rectangles, as I feel like that fits the low poly style the best, but I still haven't decided yet. I did the belly next and then followed it up with the final part of the feet because that was the hardest part and I was just putting that off for as long as possible. Before I solder this whole thing together though, I am going to run along the inside as well, just to add some solder to the interior to give it added strength. Now we finally have one half of this thing done, and it's really cool. I still need to make the other half of this, and so that means more glass, more cutting, more foiling, and more problems. So here's the thing. I'm kind of worried about both of the halves perfectly lining up with each other. I can make them pretty flat, but I'm still worried about them just aligning. So what I think I'm going to do is to just make this in parts kind of like how I've been doing it, but then joining it to the main body first. So if there are any alignment problems throughout it, then it's kind of spread out between every single joint in here. It's not necessarily all going to land on one seam, which will make it a little bit harder to assemble, but I think it'll look better later on. I'm also not a big fan of the silver color for all of the joints right now. And that's okay because I can add patina to this afterwards, and that will make all of these joints black instead of the reflective silver that it is now. Now this project has taken a lot longer than expected, since a lot of this was so complicated and working with a new medium, having never done stained glass before, but it's just such a cool material. There are so many things that I like about it, and especially on this creation. I chose this iridescent blue specifically because it had some qualities that I really liked. It almost has this holographic appearance that's kind of like referencing the Pokémon cards, which I thought was fun. But also in his later evolutions in their rare shiny form, they are actually purple instead of blue. And I thought that the little hints of purple you get throughout this glass is just a nice little Easter egg to include on this as well. Having a life-size Pokémon in this low poly style too just reminds me of all the old video games and just the terrible graphics they had. But there were still so many good memories to playing these video games as a kid. But I've talked way too much already, so I'm just gonna shut up and let this man build. And that is the end of the soldering. And man, this thing is just so cool. It's so big. Like, this thing is absolutely massive. It's kind of hard to tell the scale on this thing, but it's very big being life-sized. Now I've gone ahead and done some finishing touches to everything, added the patina to all of the joints, so now everything is black. And I think that really helps with the definition of all of the individual panels. And you can kind of see how many there actually are on this project now. It took 194 pieces of custom cut stained glass to make this thing, and it was so worth it. But there are two more things that I would like some input on from you all. The first thing is the eyes. I just ended up doing the rectangles, but I kind of wanted to hear what everyone thought, since these are pretty easy to switch out and change if there's a better idea for them. The second thing that I wanted input on was for the actual base of him. For now, I just left him open, so I could put maybe a light in here and turn him into a giant lamp. Or maybe I could make like an actual base for this to sit on. I don't really know. He's fine as is for now, but let me know what you think in the comments below. If you wanted to see some more behind the scenes stuff, you can follow me over on Instagram, or if you want to see me build something else, you can watch another video right here.